idea that the way the climate will change over the coming years is up to us is a sobering thought. We know that human activity on a large scale, massive deforestation, the near universal use of fossil fuels is changing the climate. But can anything that you or I do individually, can that have an effect? Well, over half the carbon dioxide produced by mankind comes from our domestic activities. Meet the Carbons. They're a fictional family living somewhere in the Western world. They occupy an average suburban house outside an average city. The Carbons depend on an average amount of electric power. It comes to them by an energy grid powered primarily by fossil fuels, coal, oil and natural gas. The Carbons are not bad people.
Girls, you want coffee, pancakes?
But as Westerners, they have one of the most energy-hungry lifestyles on the planet.
Girls, what's for breakfast? Yeah.
Pancakes, daddy cakes.
What's wrong, pancake?
I'll call you from the airport.
Flour.
Bye.
Bye.
Mr. Carbon's car, like most, spews out a lot of carbon dioxide. And the Carbon family has 2 cars. Every year between them, they pump a staggering 20 tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. 10 tons per car. But it's not just the cars. Running the Carbons family home with all its comforts uses almost as much energy as their vehicles do. Every device, functional or fun, has a knock-on effect. At the power plant. Scientists fear that at this rate, these everyday emissions could, within 50 years, push our climate to a critical point where change is no longer gradual, but sudden and extreme. There's no threat of extinction in the Carbons' house. On the contrary, there is plenty of food here. Often, it will have crossed continents by the time it reaches their kitchen. Transporting this food accounts for over 1/10 of the Carbons' annual greenhouse emissions. And it doesn't end there. More carbon dioxide is produced by the Carbons' rubbish. Buried in a landfill, the rubbish heats up as it decomposes, releasing greenhouse gases into the air. All the while, the carbon dioxide blanket surrounding the Earth is getting thicker, pushing the planet's ecosystems closer to the point of no return. Mr. Carbon dreams of a tropical rainforest holiday, but today he's on a business trip. But when he flies, he's contributing to the fastest growing source of carbon dioxide. Even with plans for more efficient engines, emissions from aeroplanes worldwide are set to double in the next 25 years. Altogether, the carbons are responsible for a whopping 45 tons of carbon dioxide a year. In cities all over the developed world, millions of ordinary households produce great quantities of carbon dioxide simply by going about their daily lives. So far, it's the Western world which has produced the majority of the greenhouse gases. But that is set to change. Meet Mr. and Mrs. Tan. They are a fictional couple living in an average Chinese suburb. At present, they use only 1/7 of the energy consumed by the Carbon family. But life for the Tans is changing fast. And they, together with 1.3 billion Chinese, are heading for a more energy-intensive lifestyle. Mr. Tan has got a new job, and it comes with a flat in the latest upmarket development, complete with state-of-the-art, energy-hungry fittings. To fuel their economic boom, China has one main cheap source of energy: coal. Coal is the most carbon dioxide polluting source of energy we have. Currently, China is planning to build a large coal-fired power plant every week for the next 7 years. In as little as 20 years, China is likely to become the world's #1 greenhouse gas emitter. There is an explosion in energy consumption worldwide, and by 2050 we're on course to have doubled the amount we emit.
Problems in my lifetime, and usually you go into them and become a little bit less concerned as you go along. The global warming problem is the reverse. The people who are professionals and work on it become more and more concerned through time. For me, this is the most serious of environmental problems, and it's the one that we need to solve now. If this is the amount of greenhouse gas that we emit into the atmosphere every year today, then 50 years from now, we're going to be pumping out twice that much. And to solve the problem of global warming and to prevent the atmospheric blanket from more than doubling, what we need to do instead is to freeze emissions at the current level for the next 50 years.
Because there's no single way to solve the problem of global warming, Pacala has broken it into 7 equal pieces. He's then suggested a different way we can solve each slice, one at a time, until we reach the ultimate goal of halting the rise of carbon emissions.
I've looked at it closely, and I believe that it can be solved by this generation. The technology now exists to solve the greenhouse warming problem if we develop the collective will to implement it.
The first of Steve Pacala's slices can be dealt with using technology close at hand. I met carbon counting guru Dave Ray to find out how we can all set our house in order. Okay, so here is a newly built house.
This is where really climate change begins. Our houses represent a huge amount of emissions. On a household basis in the UK, each household emits about 25 tonnes of greenhouse gas every year. So they're a huge contributor to our climate impact.
Let's have a look inside.
So this is a prime example of a lot of energy use going on in the home and actually a lot of wastage.
What, this thermostat?
Absolutely, yeah. And this one's set too high. For every degree we reduce it, we'll save about 1/3 of a tonne of greenhouse gas.
Every year?
Every year.
So that comes down?
Yeah.
And I wear a jersey?
Yeah. Dress for the weather is the bottom line.
So the Carbons, bundled up for the winter, have turned their thermostat down 3 degrees. It saves them money on their electricity bill, and each year it keeps a tonne of carbon out of the atmosphere. Television.
Yeah, this is a big one. Now, if we look at some of these gadgets down here, we've got lots of little lights. They're using energy even when you're not watching television, and together in the average home they're now accounting for about 10% of our electricity use. All these things on standby power. So they're draining electricity from the grid.
10% of all household electricity
Yeah.
goes on complete waste, simply standing by.
It's basically electricity just to power little lights.
I have to say I had no idea it was as high as that.
The rule of thumb is, if you finish using something, then turn it off.
It isn't that turning on and off a set damages it.
Well, if there is, then the manufacturers have a real problem that they need to sort out.
There are dozens of things we can do around the house, from composting vegetable waste to switching to energy-saving light bulbs. So that really will help preserve the Arctic ice cap, just by changing a bulb?
It'll do a tiny bit in the right direction. This is good news for this house because it's a gas hob rather than an electric one.
The more insulation, the better.
For an average fridge, you can save 200 kilograms of greenhouse gas just by keeping the thing clean.
And buying locally grown food can cut down on the food miles.
And they're grown right here. That's pretty cool.
If we all made the most efficient choices in our homes and offices, we would reduce those emissions by 1/4 and cut off one of Steve Pacala's global warming slices. Perhaps the simplest way most of us can combat global warming is to change the way we drive. The Carbons have opted for a more fuel-efficient car. If by mid-century 2 billion of the world's cars can do 60 miles to the gallon, it would deal with one more of the 7 slices. if we all drive half as much as we do now, which might mean using public transport instead, we will also plus a slice. Another major challenge is to find carbon-free sources of power. However controversial, tripling the world's nuclear power would cut our emissions by a further slice. This is a solar farm. 3 acres of solar panels dedicated to collecting energy directly from the sun.
Renewable sources of energy, such as solar panels, are able to produce electricity with no carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere at all. And these might be scaled up to provide a sizable fraction of the solution to the global warming problem.
In countries like China, solar is set to make a real difference. Britain's climate, however, has never been perfect for solar power, but there are other natural resources we have plenty of. Our country is the windiest place in Europe. It's impossible to comprehend the sheer size of these towers unless you get really close to them as I am now. There's nothing to give you scale, but they are immense. The diameter of the rotor is 90 meters. That's almost as long as a football pitch. And to my eyes, they're beautiful. What's best about them is that once running, they don't give off carbon dioxide. But they're not cheap. And worldwide, we would need 700,000 more turbines like these to cut another slice off global emissions. That's a very big wind farm. Of course, wind farms are only one of a number of potential sources of new energy. And it's quite clear that if we're really going to tackle climate change, we have to think even bigger. Steve Pacala believes strongly that the technology we already have can save us. He's on his way to visit one of the newest techniques, and they don't get much bigger than this. "200 kilometers off Norway's coast lies the Sleipner gas rig.
This is one of the largest objects ever lifted by people, and it's sitting here on the sea floor for the sole purpose of keeping harm out of the atmosphere.
The people who extract fossil fuels like oil and gas have now come up with a way to put carbon dioxide back underground. Already, every year, 1 million tons of carbon dioxide are being pumped down into the rocks hundreds of meters below the seabed. The Norwegians have estimated that we could store all of Europe's carbon dioxide emissions for the next few hundred years in this way. But we would need several thousand of these rigs around the world to get another slice closer to the solution.
This isn't a magic bullet. This is maybe 15% of the solution for the next generation or so. What really has me worried is the number of things that we don't yet fully understand that I call monsters behind the door. This is exactly the kind of technology that could keep those monsters from ever coming out from behind their doors. It's going to give us an additional bridge to the future for our children and their children and their children. This is our watch, and we have to get it started so that we can leave them with a world in which the monsters are still behind the doors.
Already, change is in the air, and people all over the world are waking up to the urgent need to deal with global warming. Expanding economies like China are developing new technologies to combat increasing emissions and are encouraging the people to get involved in tree planting. The task ahead of us is vast, but we can all make a difference at every level, even the smallest. All right, well now let's get this clear. It's not about stopping making ourselves cups of tea. We're talking about living the life more or less as we've lived it before, but more efficiently.
Yeah.
And waste is the source of the trouble, not actually living.
No.
Please make me a cup of tea.
Certainly will. So the first thing I'm going to do is, we don't fill it with water, obviously. We just need water for 2 mugs. It doesn't matter which nation it is, it's important.
Don't waste it. Now, to make a good cup of tea, you've got to make it while it's hot.
Yeah.
You didn't warm the pot.
I didn't warm the pot, no.
Oh well, we'll see what the quality of the tea is like.
Cheers. Any good?
Rotten.